Hello, everybody. As of today, we will be having asynchronous lessons, and this is going to be our first seminar on writing the introduction and abstract of a chemistry paper. I hope you're all very well and you can hear me very clearly. Let me just go into present mode so that you can see the screen better. The research paper process is very complicated, as you know, and it involves choosing the right topic, doing your background research, refining your topic, creating a research question. And after you experiment and you collect data, you can basically start writing later on, as you can see at the bottom, review and research and cite, edit and proofread your work. What we will do in this seminar is that we're not going to focus on all the steps of this research paper process, but what we will do is we are going to see how information is organized in different sections of a research article, how information is also organized within each section of the research article, what characteristics are expected, and what scientific conventions are to be followed. So, the typical organization of a journal article resembles an hourglass. I hope you have all seen one, where you have like the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. We say it resembles an hourglass because the wider ends of the hourglass denote some kind of extensive literature review, connection to what other people write and have to share in the research field that we are focusing on, whereas methods and results that are in the middle are known for their degree of specificity and detail. Are there any variations in this broad organization of a journal article? Yes, there are loads of them depending on the journal that you are going to publish. So one thing to know is that you need to go and read the author guidelines or the manuscript guidelines and find out what exactly is allowed to go in each section and in what order each section needs to be included in your paper. As you can see on the right hand side, we can see a variation here where we don't have the typical order of introduction, methods, results, and discussion, but we have an introduction, results and discussion, and methods at the end. Sometimes, in some journals, methods can go as a footnote. In this research paper publication process, you need to know that your ultimate goal is to publish, which means that you need to be accepted by the referees, the people that are doing the peer review. In order to do that, you need to follow certain standards. A very useful course that you could attend if you wanted to is the ACS one for peer reviewers, because it's going to give you some general highlights as to what's important when you write a paper and what reviewers who are going to decide whether your paper is good or not are going to be looking at. Another good resource for you is the book ACS Style Guide, which is online, and you can find a lot of writing tips about language and conventions that you need to use in your research article. One more important, a very, very important thing that you need to take into account is that you want to be cited by your readers. So whoever gets to read your article, excuse me, They will, you want them to cite it so that your index factor is in the paper you're publishing is higher, citation factor. Now, let's start with what we're actually going to talk about today, introductions. The most common mistake that students make when they write an introduction for a research article is that they often do not realize that this is a completely new genre and it does not always correspond to what they knew when it comes to essay writing, for example. For example, with essay writing, we might start with the questions. But in this case, we know that ACS style guides do not allow us to pose direct questions. Sometimes in essay introductions, we start with statistics. Yeah, we do have the option here, but we don't start with statistics right from the first sentence. We do something else. We kind of set the scene by mentioning the key theme, and we aim to inform, not to impress or shock, like we might have done when we write an essay. What we're going to do now is ask you to go to this Google Doc and make sure you do the first 3 tasks. What you will see is that you will find some introductions and you will find the type of article and the type of title, and you need to match them. This is just to make sure you've taken enough time to prepare for this workshop. So at this point, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and carry on after you do the first 3 tasks. The answers of your tasks should be uploaded as a comment, added as a comment in Edmodo in the respective post. Let me go to... Now I'm going to have a look at some of the tasks that you're going to be looking at. So the first task says match the titles of the articles with the journals they're published in. And the second task says read the introductions below and match the titles and with the numbers. Further down, you can see read the first sentence that is highlighted in yellow in the introductions below. What do you notice in terms of specificity? So these are the 3 questions I want you to answer. And further down, you can see all the introductions that you're supposed to be reading. This is why I asked you to pause the video. If you haven't done it already, you need to do it now. Now, as you will see, the first sentence addresses an audience that is less familiar with the topic. It sets the scene and it introduces the key theme. Another aspect that we have to take into account and include it in our introduction is answer this question: is your research important? When we write, a novice writer's mistake is often that they write in a chronological order and they report what's happened in a chronological order. Whereas what they should do is that they should find, for example, why their research is important and what gap does it fill? What research gap? Is there a niche? Have you convinced the audience that your research is important, it's valid, and it's relevant to other scientists in the same field? Have you emphasized the motivation of the work? What made you do this? And the outcome of your work is also important, including sufficient evidence to establish the validity of this outcome. Most people, not writers, now I'm going to talk about those people reading research articles. When they read introductions, they often do so because they do something that we know as footnote chasing. If you want to be a super searcher or researcher, this is what you do. You basically you read introductions and discussion sections in order to find citations and references to other people's work that is already been approved, established, and known to be of significance in the field. So you can do this in order to find relevant background information, or you can identify the key citations in your field. When you do that, then you can actually read them, you can sort them and code them in order of topics, methods, or results, significance, niche, research gaps, or whatever you're looking at. Why do we need to read the introduction? As you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, you can still see the anatomy of a scientific paper. The introduction, which is a very wide part of this hourglass, shows that our understanding of the research field. We tell people what is known in the beginning. So we set the scene. We explain the basic scientific question addressed. Then we might provide some brief historical perspective or summaries of previous work. In the second part of an introduction, we see that we provide what is unknown. What is the gap we want to fill? And we make a clear statement of research problems or approach after we identify the research gap. In the third part of an introduction, we can talk about how and why we should fill that research gap by providing either the rationale or the purpose and the hypothesis of our work. At this point, I want you to do this task. Have a look at them, and based on what we've said already, I want you to predict the order of the sentences below. You can pause the video and write down the order that you think is the right one. The first sentence says, this paper demonstrates the first reconstruction of airborne asbestos concentrations from the last century, including the periods of highest exposures. Second sentence says, asbestos fibers are naturally occurring hydrated silicate mineral fibers that have found myriad uses in the 20th century. And then it says, however, airborne asbestos fibers became the well-known recognized cause of asbestos, bronchogenic carcinoma and mesothelioma during the latter half of the century. Which sentence, you reckon, sets the scene and just introducing the theme in the wider research field? This is A. This is B. Straight away, we see asbestos fibers. This is the main theme. We start with the main theme normally and with a noun, a nominalization, as I've explained previously in my other seminars. Then we find the research gap. What is unknown? Or what is the problem? So we have this in C. And then the last part of the introduction would say this paper demonstrates this. So we express the purpose of the whole article. Now, before you move on, I would like you to go to your next task, and I want you to do task 5, where you need to suggest a plan which delineates the expected information elements in the introduction. I want you to look at 1 or 2 articles. You don't have to do that with everything. And I want you to suggest a plan, like the one I almost showed you already, which explains what are the expected information elements in an introduction. But I want you to highlight the sentences by making comments before on the Google Doc before you actually write the skeleton that I'm asking you to make. So this is going to take quite a while. So I want you to pause the video before we move on. So here we can see the structure of a typical introduction. We can see that there are 3 sections again. There is 1 sentence that identifies the research area. There is definitely 1 sentence that establishes the importance of the research area, and another sentence that provides essential background information about the research area. In these last 2 sentences, you cite a lot of relevant literature. This is the first part of the introduction. In the second part, it is necessary that you need to identify the gaps, and again, you say what other people didn't look or failed to look or overlooked in their research, which you're going obviously to feel you're going to do. So in the third part, you write sentences where you express the purpose of your work. And this is just to answer the question of how you are going to fill that gap that you mentioned there. And then you're going to preview key findings of the current work, but this is optional. It depends, on different types of journals you might be publishing. So let's have a look at the excerpt again. I want you to work on a different introduction now and apply a green highlight marker on it in order to find a sentence where you can see that explains the importance of the research area. Please pause the video here. Let's talk about the first move then, which is the first kind of sentence that is included, the first information element that is included in an introduction. As we can see, the tense that is being used when the topic is introduced is the present tense. Citations are very common, especially in the first sentence, the second and the third sentence. And regarding direct quotations, we are not allowed to use any. At this point, I want you to do another task. I want you to find a sentence in the Google Doc and that highlights relevant or previous works, like a literature review kind of thing. I want you to apply a blue highlight marker on it on your Google Doc and write as a comment, highlights relevant precedent works. You can pause the video now. Now that we've reached this point, we can have a look at these sentences and try to rewrite them. These sentences have a lot of issues, so I'm going to give you enough time to have a look at each one of them and try to rewrite them. I'm going to read them out loud for you and then let you spend as much time as you need to do this task. We used NMR spectroscopy to show that we had successfully synthesized a novel arylated quinoline, a molecule belonging to a class known to be important in biologically active compounds. This is a sentence in the introduction. This is the first sentence in an introduction. How could it change? Smith et al. Reviewed carbon nanotubes in their recent publications and showed that CNTs have novel electrical properties and many possible applications in electronic and sensing devices. This is, again, the first sentence in an introduction. How can it change? Believe it or not, with the wonders of modern science, we can now manipulate single biomolecules such as DNA and proteins, and by using highly focused laser light, we can grab them and move them to new positions in new orientations. How can we rewrite that so that it can be included in an introduction of a research article? You already know that tobacco causes cancer, but did you know that it's the nitrosamines in the tobacco that lead to carcinogenesis? So that's another sentence that needs to be changed. You can pause the video here if you haven't done it already and write your answers. At this point, you're doing very well because it means you have done a lot of work already. It must have been at least an hour that you have been working on all this. And we're going to move on and identify more sentences in the introduction sections that I have included in your Google Doc. And this time I want you to apply a light pink highlight marker on sentences that identify a research gap, and then double click and write a comment and say identifies a research gap. When you do that, we can move to the next part, which is to talk about this, how we identify the research gap in a sentence. Let's have a look at these sentences here. The sentences here say persistent electron paramagnetic resonance signals have been reported, but PM 2.5 has not been studied by EPR. So basically you say first what is done and then what is not done. First what is known and then what is not known. And then of course the next step would be, well, we are going to use EPR to study free radicals in PM 2.5 because nobody else has done this before. Another example is, although HSSPME has been applied to an enormous variety of matrices to date, the number of publications that apply SPME technology to milk samples is relatively low, and most of them are related to the determination of flavors. As you can see, I'm trying to say here that they have been applied. That's the research field. 22 and 24 are the citations that, we're going to show that they've been, focusing on this research. But then the numbers of publications that apply this technology to milk is low. So what are we going to do? We're going to apply this technology to study milk. Examples of gap statements you can find below. You can basically talk about a question that remains unanswered by not posing a direct question. What you can do, you can see in the example, it says numerous questions remain unanswered about this. What you can also do when you have a gap statement is to say that a research area remains poorly understood, misunderstood, or overlooked. So it says, so you could say, although much has been learned about this, something Y remains poorly understood. You can also talk about the next step that needs to be taken. The next step is to do this to apply this to the study of Y. You can also talk about an area that has yet to be studied, or a procedure that needs to be improved. And the last thing you can do is write about a new hypothesis or observation that needs to be validated. Corroborate. Corroborate means to verify, confirm that something is right. At this part, I want you to find yet another sentence. I want you to find a sentence in another introduction from the ones that I have already given you that introduces the current work by filling the gap, presenting the purpose or the hypothesis or rationale. It's the step after the research gap. What are we going to do to solve this problem? And I want you to apply a light purple highlight marker on it. If you have done that already, now we can talk a little bit more about this information element, this move, filling in the gap. And we can say that phrases that are common when we write about this usually start with these expressions. These expressions were identified through a computer-based analysis of about 60 published chemistry journal articles. So they usually start in this study, in this paper, in this work, in this context, in the present study, in the present work, herein. And then they state exactly what is it that they're going to do that is going to provide, something new, the niche, as we say.